Young millionaire marries a homeless girl as a bet and is surprised when he discovers a heartbreaking secret about her past that changes his life forever. Leave your like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any more exciting stories like this one. It was May in New York, but the heat had not yet set in. The biting wind danced through the streets of Manhattan, mixing the smells of smoke, garbage, and cheap coffee. Linda Turner sat in her usual corner, under the marquee of an abandoned store. A worn backpack was all she had. Inside, an old coat, a notebook full of notes, and a faded portrait of someone she hadn't seen for years. Linda wasn't like the other homeless people used to imagine. Her blue eyes carried a fierce intensity, and there was something about her upright posture that made people hesitate to offer help or judge her. She didn't beg. Survival was her only goal. On the other side of town, David Montgomery was in a private club, laughing with his friends. Sons of millionaires like him, they were bored of their own privileges. Chase Walker, the most debauched of the group, filled another glass of champagne before launching into a taunt. "You always say you can do anything, David. But would you have the courage to marry someone with nothing?" His friends laughed, finding the idea absurd. David, on the other hand, leaned forward, defiant. "What's in it for me?" $1 million, replied Chase, already laughing. "If you marry a homeless woman by Christmas and stay married until then." David pretended to think for a moment before smiling. Done. That same night, David went out with his friends on the streets of Manhattan, ready to choose the perfect candidate. Drink and boredom guided his actions, but deep down there was a desire to prove something to himself, or perhaps to challenge the emptiness he felt, even surrounded by luxury. It was then that he saw her. Linda was huddled in the corner, writing something in her notebook with a pen that was almost out of ink. David stopped, intrigued. There was something about her that made him forget, for a moment, that this was a bet. "Hey you!" he called out, reaching into the pockets of his expensive suit. Linda looked up without fear or surprise. "Are you going to kick me out of here?" she asked dryly. "No, I have a proposition." She raised an eyebrow, but didn't answer. He crouched down, ignoring the stares of his friends watching from a distance. "I want to marry you." Linda blinked in disbelief before letting out a bitter laugh. "Is this some kind of joke?" "I'm serious. It's a simple agreement. You marry me, live with me for a few months, and at Christmas we split up. In return, you'll get everything you need. A place to stay, clothes, food, whatever you want." She looked at him with disdain. "Why would I accept?" David smiled. "Because I know that living on the street isn't as much fun as you make it out to be." Linda stared at him, irritated. He didn't know anything about her, or what it was like to be there. But as he spoke, she thought. She wasn't stupid. She knew he wasn't doing it out of the goodness of his heart, but she also knew that this could be her chance to escape, at least temporarily, from the cycle that kept her trapped on the streets. "All right," she said at last. "But I have conditions." David arched an eyebrow. "What conditions?" "I'm not your doll. I'm not going to change who I am to fit into your world. And in the end, when this is over, I'll leave with what was promised, and without any debt to you." He smiled, satisfied. Done. The next day, in a discreet registry office, Linda and David signed the papers. David's friends were there, laughing and taking photos. For Linda, it seemed surreal. She had a husband now, but it was more like a contract than a marriage. David took Linda to his mansion, a vast empty place on Long Island. When they arrived, he seemed at ease, but Linda felt like an intruder. "This is your room," he said, showing her a luxurious suite. She looked around, not hiding her indifference. "All this for a sham marriage. You rich people are really strange." David laughed, but inside he was intrigued. Linda was not at all what he had expected. Over the next few days they began to live together, but the clash between their worlds was evident. Linda refused the expensive clothes David offered and avoided interacting with the house staff. She spent her afternoons writing in her notebook or walking in the garden, while David continued with his life of parties and business. But little by little, the facade began to crack. David found himself increasingly curious about Linda. Who was she before the streets? Why did she seem so unshakable? And Linda, against her will, began to realize that David wasn't just the arrogant millionaire he appeared to be. There was something else hidden beneath the cynical smile, something she couldn't ignore. The bet, which had seemed like fun for both of them, was beginning to take an unexpected turn. And while Christmas still seemed a long way off, the tension between them grew. The days following the wedding were a silent test for Linda and David. Although they were under the same roof, the emotional distance between them was immense. David tried to maintain his usual routine, meetings, parties, and casual encounters with friends, while Linda explored her new reality with the skepticism of someone who doesn't trust anything that's offered for free. Everything in the Montgomery mansion seemed designed to impress. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceilings, corridors were adorned with works of art, and the furniture was impeccably luxurious. For Linda, that world was as uncomfortable as the cold concrete of the streets. She walked through the rooms carefully, as if something might break at any moment. "You look like a fish out of water," David commented one morning as they were having coffee in the dining room. Linda looked up from the cup of tea she was holding. "Because I am," she replied bluntly. "This place isn't for someone like me." David smiled sideways, but didn't comment. He was used to women who fought for a place at his side, who molded themselves to please him. Linda was different. She made no effort to hide her discomfort or to impress him. "So, why did you accept?" he asked, breaking the silence. She stared at him for a moment, as if deciding how far she could go with the truth. "Because living on the streets is not an act of courage, it's survival. I thought I'd have a better chance here." David remained silent. As much as he wouldn't admit it, Linda's words had hit him. He knew the bet was cruel, but he had never stopped to consider what it really meant to her. Despite their differences, there was an implicit rule between them: respect each other's space. David spent most of his time away from home, and Linda took advantage of the empty mansion to explore. Most of the time she stayed in the garden, sitting under a tree with her notebook writing non-stop. One afternoon, as David was leaving for a meeting, he saw her there. She was barefoot, with her feet touching the grass, and seemed oblivious to the world around her. He hesitated before getting into the car, wondering what she was writing so much about. "Are you always this mysterious?" he asked, approaching uninvited. Linda quickly closed the notebook and held it against her chest. "It's not mystery, it's privacy," she replied firmly. David raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "It's all right. I just found it curious." She didn't reply, and he realized that it wouldn't be easy to break down the barriers she had built. That evening, Chase showed up at the mansion. He was the kind of friend who knew no bounds, and the sound of his laughter filled the room like an explosion. "So where's the famous wife?" he asked, throwing himself down on the sofa in the living room. David hesitated. "She's in the bedroom or something." "And you? How are you coping? It must be hilarious living with a woman from the streets." Before David could answer, Linda appeared in the doorway. She had heard the conversation, and although her instinct was to ignore it, she couldn't. "Hilarious," she said, crossing her arms. "Is that what you think?" Chase, surprised, raised an eyebrow and laughed. "I didn't mean to offend, dear. It was just a joke." Linda glared at him, then turned to David. "Are these the kind of people you consider friends?" she asked before leaving the room. David felt the impact of her words. Chase laughed, but David knew Linda was right. He wondered why it bothered him so much. As the weeks went by, their relationship began to change. Linda became more and more independent. Despite having everything at her disposal, she refused to depend on David. She spent most of her days out walking around Manhattan. He knew he had no right to question where she went or what she did, but curiosity ate away at him. One night she came home late. David was in the living room reading a work report when he heard the door open. "Where were you?" he asked, in a tone that sounded more possessive than he had intended. Linda stopped in the middle of the corridor and stared at him in surprise. "Does it matter?" David put down his papers and stood up. "I was just asking. It's dangerous to walk around alone at night." She let out a sarcastic laugh. "I lived on the streets for 2 years, David. I think I can take care of myself." He didn't reply. There was something in that answer that disarmed him, but he didn't know what. Meanwhile, Chase didn't let the bet go to waste. He sent frequent messages, asking how things were going, teasing David about how long it would take him to give up. "I bet she'll be gone before Christmas," Chase said one night during a phone call. David didn't reply. For the first time, he felt a twinge of irritation at hearing someone talk about Linda like that. He began to observe her more closely. The woman he thought he knew was much more complex than he had imagined. There was something about the way she looked at the world, as if she carried a weight that no one could understand. Linda, for her part, noticed the changes in David. He seemed less superficial than when she first met him, but that didn't make her trust him. She knew that the agreement had an expiration date. When Christmas came, it would all be over. And yet, something inside her began to wonder what it would be like to stay there. One Sunday, David decided to accompany her on one of her walks. "Can I come with you?" he asked, surprising her. Linda hesitated, but eventually agreed. They walked in silence through the streets of Manhattan, passing places she knew well. David noticed that Linda was greeted by some people, other homeless people who seemed to respect her. "Are you famous around here?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Not famous, just well-known," she replied. David was intrigued, but didn't want to push her. As they walked back to the mansion, Linda stopped in front of a music store and looked in the window. David, curious, followed her gaze. "Do you like music?" She nodded. "I used to play the piano." A long time ago, David was surprised. He hadn't expected to hear something like that. "Why did you stop?" Linda shrugged, as if she didn't want to go into details. "Life has a funny way of changing our plans." David sensed that there was something more there, something she wasn't ready to share. But for the first time, he felt like getting to know more about her, not out of curiosity or amusement, but because of something he couldn't explain. Christmas was still a long way off, but for David and Linda, every day seemed to bring something new. What had started out as a meaningless arrangement was now pushing them towards something neither of them could control. Months passed, and David Montgomery couldn't understand Linda Turner. Nothing about her followed the patterns he knew. She lived in the mansion as simply as she did on the street. She refused expensive clothes, ignored the dinners prepared by the best chefs, and kept her distance from everything that represented David's luxury. She was a self-assured woman who made no effort to impress. And for someone like David, this was both intriguing and irritating. He was used to women who competed for his attention, who molded themselves to please him. Linda, however, didn't even seem to notice his existence beyond the agreement between them. There were days when he watched her from his office, writing in her notebook in the garden, barefoot and wearing simple clothes that would never fit into David's world. She seemed impervious to the glamour around her, and perhaps that's why he couldn't get her out of his mind. One morning, as they ate breakfast in silence, David put down the tablet he was reading and looked at Linda. "I need you to join me for a business lunch." Linda looked up at him, clearly surprised. "Why?" "Because it's part of the deal," he replied casually. She arched an eyebrow. "I don't remember promising to be your date to ridiculous events." David sighed, leaning back in his chair. "It's not a ridiculous event. It's an important lunch with investors, and my wife needs to be by my side. They'll want to meet her." Linda remained silent, thinking. She had no interest in exposing herself to David's world, but something in his gaze made her hesitate. "What if I say no?" she asked with a challenging tone. David smiled, that characteristic smile that mixed charm and arrogance. "I'll remind you that you signed a contract." She let out a frustrated sigh, crossing her arms. "That's fine. But don't expect me to turn into something you want to show off." "It didn't even cross my mind," he replied wryly. The next day, a dress arrived at the mansion. Linda found the box on the bed when she returned from one of her walks. She opened it and found an elegant black dress accompanied by a handwritten note. "Wear this to lunch. It'll make things easier for both of us." She rolled her eyes, but knew there was no point in arguing. At the appointed time, she went up to her room, took a shower and started to get ready. She hadn't done that in years. The dress was fitted to her body, highlighting her curves in a way she didn't remember seeing in the mirror. She left her hair loose, a contrast to the simplicity of her everyday life. Meanwhile, David was waiting in the living room, fiddling with his wristwatch. He was impatient. Linda was taking longer than usual, and he was beginning to wonder if she was really coming. When the sound of her footsteps echoed down the corridor, he looked up and froze. Linda entered the room, her heels firmly touching the wooden floor. The black dress fell perfectly over her, emphasizing her elegant and determined posture. Her hair, now shiny and neat, framed her face, and her eyes, always so intense, seemed even more expressive. David was speechless. For a moment, he didn't recognize her. She stopped in front of him, adjusting her dress as if it were uncomfortable, but her raised chin indicated that there was no insecurity in her gesture. "So," she said, breaking the silence. "What do you think?" David opened his mouth to reply, but no words came out. David Montgomery was not a man who lost his composure easily. He was used to controlling every situation and every reaction. But when he looked at Linda Turner in that black dress, with a presence that seemed to light up the whole room, he was disconcerted. She was beautiful, not the artificial, predictable beauty of the women he used to have by his side, but something genuine, almost wild. Linda was a contradiction in every detail, and that fascinated him more than he was willing to admit. "Is everything all right?" Linda asked, arching an eyebrow as she realized he was still silent. David quickly regained control, straightening his tie as if nothing had happened. "Yes, it's perfect. Let's go?" Linda didn't answer. She picked up the bag she had chosen at the last minute, a discreet accessory that matched her practical posture. Despite her discomfort with the whole situation, she seemed as calm as ever. When they arrived at the restaurant, David noticed that everyone's attention immediately turned to them. It wasn't just because he was David Montgomery, one of New York's most talked-about businessmen, but because Linda had something you couldn't ignore. She was impossible to categorize. David's partners, powerful men, with their calculated smiles and impeccably dressed wives, stood up to greet him. "David?" At last. "And this is?" asked Richard Powell, one of the most important investors at the meeting. David placed his hand lightly on Linda's back, an automatic gesture. "My wife, Linda." His tone was casual, but there was something in his voice that betrayed him. He sounded more nervous than he would have liked. Linda, for her part, reached out to greet Richard without hesitation, looking him straight in the eye. "Nice to meet you," she said firmly. Richard, clearly impressed, smiled back. "The pleasure is all mine." As lunch went on, Linda surprised everyone at the table, including David. She wasn't chatty, but her words were calculated and precise. When someone asked about her, Linda shifted the focus to another subject, with a skill that intrigued even David. She walked a perfect line between politeness and reserve, never revealing more than was necessary. At one point, one of the women at the table, Stephanie, the wife of another investor, asked where Linda was from. "New York," Linda replied simply. "Oh, how interesting. And what did you do before you married David?" David held his breath. He knew this was delicate territory. But Linda, as always, seemed unfazed. "A lot of things. I had a life full of adventures." The enigmatic answer was enough to satisfy Stephanie's curiosity, and she quickly changed the subject. David realized that Linda had a rare talent. She controlled the narrative without anyone noticing. But while the others at the table seemed delighted by her presence, David was obsessed with something else. He had known Linda for months, but he had never seen her like this. It wasn't just the dress or the way she behaved, it was what lay behind it all. There was something about her that he couldn't decipher, and it drove him crazy. When lunch was finally over, the two of them went back to the car. David felt an urgent need to speak, to break the silence that had settled between them, but Linda seemed immersed in her own thoughts. "You were amazing today," he said, trying to sound casual. She glanced at him with a discreet smile. "I just did what was expected." David didn't reply immediately. He knew she was downplaying something that had been much more significant. "No, really. You surprised everyone, including me." Linda gave a short, almost sarcastic laugh. "Do you think that just because I've lived on the streets I don't know how to behave? That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean, David?" she asked, looking directly at him. He didn't have an answer. For the first time in a long time, he felt exposed, vulnerable. That evening, back at the mansion, David couldn't get Linda out of his mind. He was in his office, glass of whiskey in hand, staring into nothingness. The image of her at lunch kept haunting him. The way she walked, the way she talked, the way she seemed so at ease and yet so out of place. He tried to focus on his work, but he couldn't. Finally, he picked up the phone and called Chase. "Dude, you're not going to believe this," David began. "What now?" asked Chase, laughing on the other end of the line. "Linda, she—" David hesitated, realizing he didn't know how to finish the sentence. "What about her?" "She's nothing like I imagined." "Well, you didn't marry her because you wanted to, did you?" "It was a bet. Don't forget that, David." David remained silent, irritated by Chase's tone. I know. But she's different." Chase laughed. Different how? Are you in love? David laughed, but the sound was forced. Of course not. Then be careful not to lose focus. Remember, this is all a game, nothing more. After the call ended, David threw himself on the office sofa, trying to convince himself that Chase was right. But deep down, he knew that something was changing. Meanwhile, Linda was in her bedroom, looking at her reflection in the mirror. She had already taken off her dress and changed into her comfortable clothes, but the image she had seen earlier was still fresh in her mind. She sighed, closing her eyes for a moment. She knew that lunch had shaken David in some way, but that didn't worry her. What really bothered her was how living with him was starting to get to her. She didn't want to feel anything for him. She couldn't. Over the next few days, David began to change his attitude. He spent more time at home, observing Linda from afar. Every little detail about her, her gestures, her words, even the way she avoided interacting with him more than necessary, made him want to understand her more. Linda, for her part, noticed the change, but made a point of maintaining the barriers between them. She knew that David was a dangerous man, in a way that had nothing to do with violence or power. He was dangerous because he could make her feel something she had sworn she would never feel again. Christmas was still a long way off, but the weight of that agreement was beginning to be felt. They both knew they were in uncharted territory, but neither of them was ready to admit what it really meant. And as the clock continued to tick down, a secret that Linda was keeping threatened to emerge, putting everything at risk. David Montgomery was becoming increasingly obsessed with Linda Turner. It wasn't a romantic obsession, at least that's what he told himself, but a curiosity that grew every day. She was an enigma. None of her actions followed his expectations. What intrigued him most was the notebook Linda carried everywhere. He often saw her writing in silence with a concentration that seemed to put her in another world. David had tried to ask her what was in it, but she always refused. "My stuff," she would say, with that firm tone that cut off any attempt to delve deeper. The barrier she erected between them only increased David's fascination. Linda was a confident, independent woman who didn't want to please anyone, least of all him, and that was something David wasn't used to dealing with. He tried to get closer, to find ways of creating a bridge between them, but Linda didn't make it easy. She kept conversations to a minimum and seemed immune to any charm he tried to use. This only made him more frustrated and, somehow, more determined. That night, David went to a party with Chase and other friends. The atmosphere was the usual: loud music, expensive drinks, and forced laughter. Chase, as usual, wasted no time in teasing. "What's up, Montgomery? How's the fairy tale going?" David, already irritated before he even arrived, threw Chase a blank look, but he continued. "It must still be hell waking up next to her, huh? I mean, she's got smells from the streets imprinted on her, right?" The other friends laughed, but David remained silent. Something inside him was starting to boil. "I bet you're counting down the days to Christmas," Chase continued, laughing. "Come on, David. Admit that this is all hilarious." David felt his jaw tense. He looked around, realizing how everyone was laughing at the expense of Linda, a woman they didn't even know. He picked up his glass, took a long sip, but couldn't calm down. "You know what's funny?" he said finally. Chase, still laughing, looked at him. "What's funny?" "How you can't stop talking about my wife." The silence that followed was embarrassing. Chase opened his mouth to reply, but David was already getting up. "Have fun without me," he said, leaving quickly. When they got home, the mansion was silent. David threw his keys on the table and went upstairs. But as he passed through the corridor that led to the music room, he heard something that made him stop. It was the sound of a piano. David stood still for a moment, thinking he was imagining things. But the melody continued, fluid and emotional, filling the emptiness of the house. He followed the sound, his heart beating faster with every step. When he reached the living room door, he found Linda sitting at the piano, playing as if she were alone in the world. She was barefoot, wearing simple clothes, but her posture was impeccable. Her fingers danced across the keys with a skill he would never have imagined she possessed. The music was intense, full of emotion. David felt something inside him break. He had never seen her like this, so vulnerable and so powerful at the same time. It was as if the music was the language she used to say everything she never said in words. He stood there, in the shadow of the door, listening and being moved. It was a side of Linda he had never seen, a side that seemed to hide all her pain, all her strength and all her soul. But then he made an involuntary movement. A timber floor creaked under his weight. Linda stopped abruptly, her hands frozen on the keys. She turned her head slowly, her eyes fixed on David with an intensity that made her heart race. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice low but full of tension. David hesitated. "I heard the music. You play very well." Linda stood up quickly, as if being caught would expose her in a way she couldn't bear. It wasn't for anyone to hear. Before he could say anything else, she left the room. David followed her down the corridor, but stopped when he heard the sound of her bedroom door locking. He stood there in the empty corridor, feeling the weight of that moment. For the first time, he realized that there was much more to Linda than he had ever imagined. But what exactly was she hiding? David stood for a long time in front of the locked door to Linda's room. The silence of the corridor was oppressive, but his mind was filled with the melody he had heard moments before. The music Linda had played seemed to carry a story that he didn't know, but desperately wanted to understand. When he finally turned away, he felt a mixture of frustration and fascination. Linda was a mystery that he didn't know how to decipher. The security with which she lived, her resistance to sharing any details about herself, and now that unexpected skill on the piano, everything seemed to build up a woman far more complex than he had imagined. Back in the office, David grabbed a glass of whiskey and tried to work, but his mind was stuck on Linda. The image of her playing the piano, so vulnerable and at the same time unattainable, wouldn't leave his mind. The next morning, Linda appeared in the kitchen as if nothing had happened. She was dressed in her simple, unpretentious clothes, her hair messily tied up. There was something in her eyes, however, that seemed more cautious than usual. David, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, looked up at her. "About last night?" "There's nothing to talk about last night," Linda interrupted, opening the fridge and taking out a glass of juice. He frowned, annoyed at the way she dismissed the subject. "You play the piano, and you don't just play. You play like someone who has practiced for years." Linda shrugged, not even looking at him. "Maybe I did. Why didn't you ever mention that?" She stopped, finally turning to face him. "Because it's not important." David let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Not important? Linda, you have an incredible talent and you act as if it's a shameful secret." "Because it's not your business, David," she said firmly. He stared at her, trying to find the right words, but Linda was already leaving the kitchen. He felt a wave of frustration mixed with something he couldn't define. Linda kept putting up walls that he couldn't break through. Over the next few days, the tension between them only grew. David realized that he was becoming more and more interested in Linda, but he also sensed that she was doing everything she could to keep him at a distance. He tried to create opportunities for them to talk, but Linda was evasive. She spent more time outside the mansion or in the garden, always with her notebook. One afternoon, David saw her on the terrace, writing. He approached her, determined to find out more about her. "You've never told me what you write in that notebook," he said, sitting down next to her. Linda quickly closed the notebook, as she always did, and held it against her chest. "And I never will." "Why so secretive?" She sighed, out of patience. "Because some things are mine, they're not part of the deal." David knew that insisting would only make her close herself off even more, so he backed off. But curiosity continued to consume him. What was Linda hiding in that notebook? That evening, David had a business dinner in Manhattan. He was distracted throughout the event, barely listening to the conversations around him. When he returned home, it was late, and the mansion was completely silent. He passed the music room, but this time he didn't hear the piano. Something prompted him to enter, perhaps a hope that Linda would be there again. But the room was empty, the piano unmoving. David walked over to the instrument and ran his fingers over the keys, trying to imagine Linda playing. He pressed a few random notes, creating a clumsy sound that seemed ridiculous compared to the melody he had heard a few days earlier. He got up and left the room, determined not to let his obsession with Linda overwhelm him. Meanwhile, in the bedroom, Linda was sitting on the bed, her notebook open on her lap. She was drawing random circles in the margins of the pages, an attempt to distract her mind. David's presence in the music room had messed with her more than she wanted to admit. She remembered the moment she saw him standing in the doorway, the way he seemed touched by the music. It was something she hadn't expected, and something that scared her. Linda closed her notebook tightly and put it to one side. She knew she was starting to feel things she shouldn't be feeling. David was a complex man, but he was part of a world she had never wanted for herself. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't ignore the way he looked at her sometimes, as if he wanted to understand her. And that was dangerous. In the days that followed, David began to ask more direct questions about Linda's past. "Why did you end up on the streets?" he asked once while they were walking in the garden. Linda stopped and looked him straight in the eye. "Because of choices I made." "What kind of choices?" She hesitated for a moment, but then gave a dry smile. "The ones that don't concern you." David wanted to insist, but he knew she wouldn't give in. He felt he was getting closer and closer to understanding Linda, but there was still something she was holding on to with all her might. One evening, while Linda was in the kitchen making tea, David came in leaning against the counter. "You don't trust me, do you?" he asked bluntly. She looked at him, surprised by the directness of his question. "It's not about trust, David. It's about knowing where to draw the line. And are those boundaries impenetrable?" She gave a half smile but didn't answer. David stared at her, frustrated and intrigued at the same time. He knew he was becoming emotionally involved in a way he had never planned. What had started out as a bet now seemed like much more than a game. But as Christmas approached, he also knew that something had to change. And Linda, as much as she tried to hide it, felt that the walls she had built were beginning to erode. The days following the piano incident were an exercise in silent tension between Linda and David. He tried to ignore his growing curiosity, but Linda's presence intrigued him more and more. Her figure, at once strong and so clearly marked by a painful past, became impossible to ignore. David began to notice the details. When she wasn't writing in her notebook, she held it close as if it were a piece of her soul. There was a devotion in that gesture, a protection that he couldn't understand. One evening, while Linda was in the garden, David went to her room. He had no intention of invading her privacy, but the notebook was there on the bed, open. The curiosity was overwhelming. He stopped at the door, struggling with himself. Finally, he stepped forward and picked up the notebook. It wasn't just filled with words, but also with sheet music. He recognized the song notes and saw touching lyrics written next to the pages. Each line seemed to tell a story. Words like hero, sacrifice, and eternal love jumped off the pages. He flipped further, finding scribbles that mentioned a name, Robert Turner. David was so immersed that he didn't notice when Linda entered the room. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice low but full of tension. He turned around quickly, holding the notebook as if he were a child caught up in mischief. I didn't want to invade your privacy, I just—" Linda snatched the notebook from his hands, closing it tightly. "This notebook isn't for you," she said, her eyes blazing. David hesitated. He knew he had crossed a line, but he also knew that the notebook held answers. "Linda, I'm sorry, but you need to understand. I want to know. I want to understand you." She took a deep breath, holding the notebook against her chest. For a moment it seemed as if she wouldn't say anything, but then, as if a dam had broken, she spoke. "My father," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "He's the reason for this notebook." David watched her intently without interrupting. "I was rich. I grew up in a huge house with everything a child could want. My father was my world. He was kind, loving, and taught me to play the piano. Every song I write is for him." David sensed the emotion in her words. It was the first time Linda had spoken about herself with such honesty. "What happened to him?" David asked softly. She hesitated but continued. "Wrong business deals, wrong friendships. He ended up in prison. But my father wasn't a corrupt man. He told the police everything. He gave away every dirty secret of the people he was involved with." Linda paused, her eyes fixed on some distant point, as if reliving the memories. "That's why he disappeared. Shortly after making the deal with the police, he disappeared. I waited for weeks, then months, but he never came back." "And you never knew what happened to him?" David asked, his voice full of empathy. She shook her head. "He was presumed dead years later. I never believed it. For me, he was always my hero, my protector. But he left me." David felt a tightness in his chest. He had never seen Linda so vulnerable. "And your mother?" "My mother died when I was a baby. I only had my father, and when he disappeared, I was left with my stepmother." There was a venom in Linda's voice at the mention of the woman. "She took everything, all the money, the possessions, the house. She ran off and left me behind." David remained silent. He couldn't imagine how anyone could abandon a child like that. "I ended up in an orphanage," Linda continued. "And when I grew up, I preferred the street to living under rules and expectations that weren't mine." David felt a lump in his throat when he heard that. It all made sense now. Linda's resilience, her refusal to depend on anyone, her passion for the piano. "What about the notebook?" he asked. She gripped the notebook tighter. "It's the only thing that keeps me connected to it. All the songs I write are for him. It's my way of remembering who he was, and not forgetting what he meant to me." David wanted to say something, but words seemed insufficient. He had never imagined that Linda carried such a painful past, and now he understood why she protected herself so much. "Linda, She interrupted him, raising her hand. "I don't want your pity, David. I've survived so far on my own, and I'm going to continue to do so." David watched her as she walked away, taking the notebook with her. He knew that the wall she had built was higher and more solid than he had imagined, but at that moment he made a decision. He would do anything to help Linda face the ghosts of her past, even if she never asked. And deep down, a doubt began to grow. What if her father was still alive? After Linda's revelation, David became restless. He couldn't get her story out of his head, especially the image of a young woman left at the mercy of the world while carrying the weight of losing everything she loved. The next morning, he found her in the garden, notebook in hand as usual. She was so engrossed that she didn't notice him approaching until he sat down next to her. "Linda, I want to help you," he said firmly. She glanced at him, a mixture of surprise and skepticism in her eyes. "Help? How?" David took a deep breath. "We're going to find clues about your father, no matter how long it's been or how difficult it is. He deserves to be remembered, and you deserve answers." Linda remained silent, considering his words. It was hard for her to trust anyone, especially someone like David, whose world was so different from hers. But there was something in his voice, a sincerity she hadn't expected. "Why?" she asked at last. "Because you deserve it," he replied, looking her in the eye. Linda hesitated but nodded. "That's fine, but don't get your hopes up. We probably won't find anything. So we'll try anyway." David hired a private detective the next day. They revisited Robert Turner's prison records and looked for information about the deal he had made with the police. Although time had erased many clues, the detective found some names associated with the case, including Robert's former business colleagues and investigators who had worked with him. Linda and David began making visits, going from offices to police stations, trying to pull out fragments of information that might lead them to some concrete clue. "Do you remember someone called James Whittaker?" David asked, holding up a list of names the detective had sent him. Linda frowned. "My father mentioned him a few times. He was a friend, I think. He's on the list. Let's go visit him." They got in the car and drove to a neighboring town, where Whittaker lived. During the journey, Linda was silent, looking out of the window. David noticed her restlessness and tried to soften the mood. "You know, I'm impressed with you," he said. Linda turned to him, confused. "Impressed? You've been through so much, and you're still here. You're still strong." She gave him a sad smile. "Being strong isn't a choice, David. It's a necessity." He felt a tightness in his chest at that answer. When they arrived at Whittaker's house, they discovered that he had died years ago. His widow, a nice old woman, tried to help, but she didn't know anything that could be useful. "He never talked about what happened to Robert Turner," she said, while pouring tea. "I'm sorry." Linda thanked her and left before she had finished her tea. David followed her, seeing the frustration in her eyes. "Let's keep going," he said, trying to cheer her up. "We're chasing ghosts, David," she replied bitterly. "There's no one else to ask." David touched her shoulder gently. "I'm not giving up, Linda, and neither should you." The weeks passed, and the investigations continued. They spoke to former police officers, Linda's childhood friends, and even people who had worked with her stepmother, but everything led to dead ends. However, the search brought something unexpected. It brought Linda and David closer together in a way that neither of them could ignore. They began to share more than just their investigations. They started having lunch together regularly, sharing stories, and moments of comfortable silence. "It's strange," Linda once said, as they ate in a small, cozy cafeteria. "What?" David asked. "I've never felt so connected to someone before." David looked at her for a moment, surprised. "Neither have I." Linda looked away, but a discreet smile appeared on her face. Trips in search of clues had also brought them together. David made her laugh with his clumsy attempts to remain optimistic, while Linda impressed him with her determination and courage. Finally, December arrived. The cold invaded New York and the city was taken over by Christmas lights. Linda and David continued their investigations, but the lack of answers began to weigh on them. One evening, after a fruitless visit to yet another person who knew nothing, Linda was sitting on the sofa in the living room. David came in with 2 mugs of hot chocolate and sat down next to her. "It seems there's nothing more we can do," she said, looking down at the drink in her hands. "That's not true. We've done everything we can. And even if we haven't found any answers, maybe this is his way of telling you to move on." Linda looked at him, surprised by the depth of his words. "Move on," she repeated, as if tasting the idea. David nodded. "He'd be proud of who you've become, Linda. I'm sure of it." She felt her eyes water, but she didn't let the tears fall. Instead, she smiled at David, and in that moment, something changed. There was something in the air between them, a tension they could no longer ignore. Their gazes met, and David felt an almost uncontrollable urge to kiss her, but he hesitated. "Linda." "Yes?" The silence between them was so intense that it seemed to fill the room. They both knew they were on the verge of something bigger than they could control. And Christmas and the end of the bet were only a few days away. The silence in the living room after that moment on the sofa seemed deafening. David and Linda kept staring at each other, their gazes full of everything they couldn't say. Something had changed. It was no longer just curiosity or forced coexistence. It was an invisible bond, undeniable and at the same time terrifying for both of them. "David," Linda began, but her voice was low, hesitant. He interrupted, shaking his head. "You don't have to say anything." She looked away, unable to cope with the intensity of the moment. She picked up the mug of hot chocolate that was still in her hands and stood up. "It's getting late. Good night, David." He watched as she left the room, the soft sound of her footsteps disappearing down the corridor. David sat there alone, thinking about everything that had happened over the last few months. The bet seemed so distant now, almost irrelevant. His feelings for Linda had nothing to do with the deal. And for the first time in his life, David Montgomery, the man who had always had everything at his fingertips, felt afraid. Over the next few days, Linda seemed more reserved than usual. She spent less time in the garden and more time alone in her room or writing in her notebook. David respected her space but couldn't stop watching her, trying to decipher her thoughts. "Are you all right?" he asked one morning, while they were having coffee in the kitchen. "I am," she replied without raising her eyes. "Are you sure?" She finally looked at him, the intensity in her eyes making him hold his breath. "Why do you care, David?" He hesitated. "Because I—" He stopped, swallowing. "Because I care." Linda lowered her eyes again, fiddling with the plate in front of her. "That doesn't make sense." "Maybe it doesn't, but it's the truth." She didn't answer, and the silence that followed was heavy. The night was still and the mansion was plunged into almost absolute silence. David, unable to concentrate on his work, decided to walk around the house. As he walked down the main corridor, a soft, delicate sound made him stop. It was the piano. He followed the sound, driven by curiosity and something he couldn't explain. When he reached the entrance to the music room, he stopped abruptly. Linda was there, sitting at the piano, but not as he was used to seeing her. She was wearing a light, flowing dress, which left her back bare and highlighted her hair, loose in waves that fell to her shoulders. Under the soft light of the lamp, she seemed to belong to another world. David felt his heart race. It was as if the air in the room had changed, become denser, more charged. He stood there, motionless, while her fingers danced across the keys, creating a melody that seemed to have a life of its own. He couldn't say how long he listened. The music filled every empty space, touching something inside him that he didn't even know existed. Finally, Linda stopped playing. She sighed, still on her back, not realizing that she wasn't alone. David stepped forward, not wanting to interrupt the moment, but the sound of his shoes on the floor caught her attention. Linda turned slowly, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, no one spoke. The intensity of the gaze they shared was almost palpable. "David," she said softly, surprised. "I'm sorry," he replied sincerely. "I didn't mean to interrupt." She remained silent, still sitting at the piano, her breathing slightly quickened. "You play in a way that—" David hesitated, trying to find the words. "I've never heard anything like it before." Linda looked away, visibly uncomfortable. "It's nothing. It's just something I do for myself." He took another step forward, without taking his eyes off her. "It's nothing. Linda, that's incredible. You're incredible." She looked at him again, her eyes shining with a mixture of emotions. "Why do you say things like that?" she asked, her voice low. "Because it's true." Linda shook her head, her lips pressed together in a tense line. "You don't know who I am, David." "I know enough," he replied firmly. She stood up slowly, turning completely towards him. The light dress swayed as she moved, and David had to fight the urge to simply move closer. "No, you don't," she continued. "You think you do, but you don't understand what it means to live with everything I've lost." David took another step, now just a few centimeters away from her. "You haven't lost everything, Linda. You still have yourself." She laughed, a bitter sound that contrasted with her delicacy. "That's easy to say for someone who's never lost anything." He raised his hand, almost touching her face, but hesitated. "You're wrong. I have lost something. Something I didn't even know I was looking for." Linda looked at him, confused. "What's that?" "You." The silence that followed was filled with emotion. Linda tried to answer, but couldn't. Instead, she took a step back, but David followed her. "Don't run away from me, Linda. Please, Linda." She shook her head, fighting back tears. "I can't, David. I can't be what you want. I don't want you to be anything but yourself." Linda took a deep breath, but before she could say anything, David took the last step between them. He gently held her face, his eyes fixed on hers, as if asking for permission. She didn't resist. The kiss began softly, but quickly became intense, as if they were both pouring out everything they had repressed for months. Linda felt the barriers she had built up over the years begin to crumble, and it scared her, but it also freed her. David pulled her closer, and for a moment the world around them ceased to exist. When they finally separated, they were both panting. "Linda," David began, but she put a finger over his lips, interrupting him. "Don't say anything," she ordered, her voice hoarse. She pulled him to the living room sofa where they sat together, still connected. The evening unfolded in a whirlwind of emotions, whispered conversations and hesitant touches that soon became more confident. There in the music room they allowed themselves to forget the past, the bet, the world around them. When dawn came, Linda was nestled in David's arms. But as he slept, a thought invaded his mind. What if it all ends when Christmas comes? The morning after the magical night in the music room was bathed in a golden light that invaded the curtains of the Montgomery mansion. Linda woke up slowly, feeling the warmth of David's body still close to hers. They were cuddled up on the sofa, covered only by a blanket he had pulled from a corner of the room in the early hours of the morning. For a moment, Linda was still, watching him. He looked so different there, vulnerable and peaceful, without the barriers that normally protected him from the world. It was a sight that made her uneasy and at the same time, inexplicably comfortable. David opened his eyes slowly, as if he knew she was watching him. "Good morning," he said, his voice hoarse from sleep. "Good morning," she replied, looking away as she felt the heat rise to her face. He stood up slightly, leaning on one elbow, and smiled. "Any regrets?" Linda snorted, feigning contempt, but there was a smile hidden on her lips. "That's typical of you, isn't it? Always so confident." David laughed, but his eyes looked at her with a seriousness that surprised her. "I wasn't just saying that, Linda. I mean, that was important to me." She felt her chest tighten. She was used to holding in her feelings, but there was something about David that made the walls she had built begin to crumble. "I know," she said at last. He touched her hand gently. "I want you to know that for me it doesn't matter what happened before or how we started. You're all that matters now." Linda looked away, trying to hide the emotion that threatened to escape. "You talk as if this is going to last forever." "Because I want it to," he replied without hesitation. She looked at him, surprised by the honesty in his voice. "David," she began, but he interrupted her. "Linda, you don't have to say anything now. I just want you to know how I feel." She nodded, unable to find the right words. The following days were full of subtle changes. David and Linda spent more time together, their gestures becoming more natural, as if something between them had finally found equilibrium. They had lunch together, explored the city and shared conversations about everything and nothing at the same time. Linda, for the first time in years, began to feel that she had a place where she belonged. One such afternoon, as they walked through a Christmas market, David stopped in front of a stall selling small souvenirs. He picked up a silver pendant in the shape of a piano and handed it to Linda. "For you," he said with a smile. She looked at him in surprise. "Why?" "Because it represents something important about you. Because it represents something important about you. And I want you to never forget that." Linda held the pendant, touched. "Thank you," she said softly. They continued their walk, and as they returned to the mansion that evening, Linda felt that something had changed, not just in David, but inside her. Christmas morning arrived with an almost magical softness. The Montgomery mansion was decorated with lights and garlands, and the scent of pine mixed with the smell of freshly baked cookies filled the air. But at the center of it all was not the festivities. It was the truth that David had finally decided to face. He had spent the last week thinking about what he would do. Linda was more than he had ever imagined having in his life. She was strength, authenticity, and, above all, the reason why he could no longer live as he had before. That morning, David sent out invitations to a special Christmas dinner. Every one of his friends, including Chase, received the call. "Are you really going to do this?" Linda asked, watching him as he finished going over the last details. David turned to her, his gaze full of determination. "Yes, it's time to get it over with." Linda hesitated but nodded. Since the night they had given themselves to each other, something between them had changed irrevocably. They had spent the last few days closer than ever, and Linda knew that David was ready to face the consequences of the bet. As the evening drew in, David's friends began to arrive, one by one. Chase, as always, was the first, bringing his debauched smile and a bottle of expensive whiskey. "So, Montgomery," began Chase as he entered the main hall, "I'm looking forward to hearing how your little theater ended." David smiled sideways, but didn't reply. He led them into the dining room where the table was impeccably set. Linda hadn't come down yet, and he knew that the right moment had to be carefully calculated. Once everyone was settled, Chase wasted no time. "Well, let's get down to business. The bet. Can you tell me what it was like being married to a girl from the streets? Was it fun?" The other friends laughed, but David remained silent for a moment, holding a glass of wine. Then, calmly, he stood up. "Chase, you're right about one thing," he began, his voice firm but controlled. "That bet was a joke, a stupid joke that should never have happened." The laughter at the table stopped. All eyes were fixed on David, who was now looking at them seriously. "But something happened," he continued. "Something that none of you could have foreseen." He gestured towards the door, and at the same moment, Linda appeared. She was radiant in a simple but elegant red dress that highlighted her natural beauty. Her hair was tied up in a soft bun, and her face displayed a calm that hid the anxiety she felt inside. David walked up to her, took her hand, and led her to the center of the room. "I want to officially introduce my wife," he said, looking at Linda with a twinkle in his eye. "Not as part of a bet, not as a game, but as the woman I love." The room fell absolutely silent. Chase seemed to choke on his own wine, while the others exchanged perplexed glances. Linda looked at David, surprised by the strength in his words. He squeezed her hand, as if to say silently that everything was fine. "And there's one more thing," said David, a smile appearing on his face. He looked at Linda, who nodded softly, before turning back to the guests. "We're going to have children." The shock in the room was palpable. Chase, finally recovering, let out an incredulous laugh. "Is this serious? Are you really going to carry on with this farce?" David took a step towards him, but his tone remained controlled, his posture firm. "There's no farce here, Chase. Linda is my wife. Not because you suggested it, not because there was money involved, but because I chose her." Chase opened his mouth to retort, But David continued without giving him time. "And I'm going to be a father. Not one, but 2 children. And you know what's most important? I'm happy. For the first time in a long time, I know who I am and what I want." He looked at Linda, who was watching him with eyes full of emotion. "And it's all thanks to her." The silence that followed was overwhelming. Chase, clearly uncomfortable, muttered something inaudible and turned his attention to the wine in front of him. The other friends exchanged glances, some visibly touched by David's sincerity. Linda stepped forward, finally breaking the silence. "To all of you who only saw me as part of a bet, I don't care. Because what we have here," she looked at David, her voice firm and full of emotion, "is real." David squeezed her hand and smiled. "Let's have dinner," he said at last, leading Linda to the seat next to him. The evening continued in an unexpectedly harmonious way. Some of David's friends started talking to Linda, now seeing her in a new light. Her presence, previously ignored or underestimated, was now seen as something powerful and genuine. When dinner was over, Chase approached David while the others left. "I think I owe you an apology," he said, without looking directly at his friend. David said nothing more. He knew that Chase had a long way to go to understand the weight of his actions, but this was the first time he had seen anything close to regret in his eyes. Later, when everyone had left, David and Linda were in the living room, sitting on the sofa, where everything had changed for the first time. "So, how do you think it went?" Linda asked with a shy smile. David laughed, pulling her closer. "I think it was perfect." She looked at him, her face softening. "You stood up to everything for me today. You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," he said, holding her face gently. "You're my wife, Linda, my family. And now we're a bigger family." She placed her hand on her still flat belly, her gaze full of hope. "That's scary, David." "I know," he replied with a smile. "But it's the most wonderful thing that's ever happened to me." Linda leaned her head on his shoulder, and the two of them stood there in silence while the Christmas tree lights flickered softly in the background. For the first time in a long time, Linda felt like she belonged somewhere, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to. And for the first time in his life, David felt he had something money could never buy: true love, a family, and the promise of a future he couldn't wait to live. If you like this heartwarming story, leave a like, subscribe to the channel to follow more stories like this, and activate the bell so you don't miss anything new. Oh, and don't forget to check out the video that's appearing here on the screen. I'm sure you'll love it.